Okay, think about this for a second. A small metal box, right? Maybe weighs a pound, runs off a simple battery. But inside that little thing, it's got the power to totally reshape music, how we even hear a guitar. We're talking about what happens between the guitar and the amp. So today, yeah, we're doing a deep dive into Electro Harmonix, or EHX, as pretty much everyone calls them. This company is just so central to pedal history. I mean, looking at their old catalogs, it's like reading a timeline of rock, grunge, all sorts of experimental music.
Absolutely. And our mission today really is to pull out the key bits of history, the innovation, the cultural impact EHX had, all from the source material. Think of this dive as your shortcut to getting why this specific company, founded by a guy who used to sell IBM machines, somehow became this massive disruptor in music tech.
An IBM salesman. That's just wild. Mike Matthews, right? Founded EHX in '68 New York City. And apparently it was just because he loved loud rock music and saw a gap in the market. But the fascinating part, their first big hit wasn't some crazy fuzz monster. It was the LPB1.
Yeah, the LPB1, linear power booster. Sounds simple, right? It was this tiny, pretty affordable plug-in booster. Its job was just to give guitars a bit more kick, more sustain. But looking at the bigger picture, the LPB1 proved something huge. It showed you could build a whole successful business just on changing tone, on transforming sound.
Okay, so why is that such a big deal? I mean, Maestro, Vox, Sola Sound, they were making effects too. What made EHX different right from the start?
It really boils down to independence and focus. See, those other companies you mentioned, they were often just like small parts of bigger companies making amps or guitars. Think Gibson, Fender, that sort of thing. Matthews built EHX only to make effects. That was their whole game. They didn't have to worry about selling guitars, so they were free to just experiment. Go nuts, really. And crucially, price things so actual working musicians could buy them.
Right, that freedom. And that allowed them to push pedals way beyond just, basic fuzz and wah, which was kind of the standard in the late 60s. So let's unpack this golden age, the 70s blueprint. What was it about that time, that environment, that let them basically set the stage for modern effects?
Well, 1970s New York City, it was just this melting pot of creativity, maybe a little grimy, and EHX really tapped into that energy. The whole era for them was about bold engineering, sometimes risky stuff, paired with that affordable price point. That was key. They sort of understood that if you made a weird box cheap enough, musicians would buy it, figure it out, and make new sounds with it.
And when you say EHX innovation, you kind of have to start with the Big Muff Pi. Came out in '69. The source material basically calls it the most famous fuzz or distortion pedal ever. Yeah. Why that one? What made the Big Muff the icon when there were tons of fuzz pedals around?
It's just the sheer sound of it, the weight, the sustain. It wasn't just buzzy clipping. It gave you this incredible, almost endless sustain. People call that violin-like quality,
Yeah.
Especially for solos. And it just crossed genres instantly. You had David Gilmour using it for these soaring, epic leads, but then you also had bands like Sonic Youth using it for pure noise and texture. It could be smooth, or it could just crush you.
And that shows up in the collector's market too, doesn't it? All those later versions, the Ram's Head, Green Russian, Civil Wars, they all have their own followings based on tiny circuit differences.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Huge collector's items. But, the really groundbreaking stuff wasn't just making distortion louder or better. It was bringing sounds into pedal form that used to only exist in big, expensive studios.
Okay, yeah, let's talk modulation. The Small Stone Phaser, 74, that's a classic sound, right? That watery swirl. But the Electric Mistress in 75, this is where, like you said, it gets really interesting.
It's a perfect example of bringing studio tech to the masses. The Electric Mistress, it was the very first flanger in a pedal, period. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, before that pedal, flanging was this physical studio trick. You needed two tape machines playing the same thing, and you'd literally press your finger on the flange, the edge of one tape reel, to slow it down slightly. Creates that whooshing sound.
Wow. So EHX took that complex, manual, tape-based process and somehow crammed it into a little metal box you could stomp on.
Exactly. It made that huge, sweeping jet plane sound available live on stage in real time. It totally changed the economics of getting those sounds. And we can't skip the small clone chorus either. That shimmery, watery sound is just completely tied to Kurt Cobain, and the whole sound of Nirvana's Nevermind.
They weren't stopping at modulation, though. They jumped right into melting with time, pitch, even synthesis, basically.
Right. Which brings us to the absolute legend, the Deluxe Memory Man. 1976. This was one of the very first delay pedals to successfully add modulation, like chorus or vibrato, to the repeats. But doing that needed some pretty specific tech for the time. Bucket Brigade chips.
Okay, you hear bucket brigade ships or BBDs thrown around all the time with vintage gear. For someone who's maybe not deep in the tech weeds, what are these things and why were they so important for that classic EHX delay sound?
Okay, think of a BBD like a tiny, tiny assembly line. It's made of miniature capacitors like little buckets. The audio signal, as an electrical charge, gets passed down this line from one bucket to the next, step by step. And because it's an analog process, each step introduces a tiny bit of signal loss, a little softening, a warmth. That's the analog decay people love. It's not a perfect, sterile digital copy like you get today. It's a repeat that sounds, well, organic. It degrades naturally.
That makes total sense. So they nailed analog delay, but then they went totally left field with stuff like the microsynthesizer in the late 70s.
Yeah, the microsynth, that thing was proof they were just way ahead of the curve. It was basically a guitar synthesizer in a pedal. It gave guitar players filters, octave effects, ways to shape the attack of the note. You can make your guitar sound like a synth or horns or whatever. And that kind of expansive thinking led to other really cool, useful niche pedals too, like the Dr. Q. That's an auto wah, right? An envelope filter.
Right, envelope filter. Explain that simply. What is it doing?
It's basically a wah pedal you don't control with your foot. Instead, the wah sound opens and closes based on how loud you play. You're playing dynamics. So the harder you pick, the more the filter opens, gives you that funky quack sound. It reacts to you. And the bass balls pedal, which was like a dual envelope filter, that became a massive hit with bass players for getting that really articulate, funky sound.
So you've got these innovative pedals. They're affordable. They're getting out there. It feels like EHX wasn't just selling gear. They were kind of part of the counterculture.
Absolutely. Yeah, because they were cheap and easy to get. They ended up in the hands of punk bands, new wave artists, experimental folks, people who were actively trying not to sound like the big polished rock bands. The Big Muff logo itself sort of became this symbol. Like if you saw that, you knew it was probably going to be loud and maybe a little abrasive, creative, definitely.
But innovation costs money, and the 80s. Well, the 80s were tough for a lot of independent companies like EHX. What happened? What caused that decline in the mid-80s?
It was kind of a perfect storm, really. Multiple things hit them at once. First, just the cost of making things in the U.S. was going up. Second, they suddenly had really serious, well-funded competition. You had Boss and other Japanese companies flooding the market with reliable, mass-produced pedals. And U.S. companies like MXR were getting leaner, too. And third, this was a killer. The supply chain for key parts started drying up. Remember those bucket brigade chips for the deluxe memory man? They became really hard to get reliably as the industry started shifting towards digital technology. And if you can't build your flagship product consistently, well, your business model kind of falls apart.
So by the mid-80s, they stopped making pedals in the U.S. That sounds like game over. But Mike Matthews, he pulls off this incredible, completely unexpected move. He takes the whole operation essentially overseas.
Yeah, it's an amazing pivot. He started manufacturing pedals again, but also high-quality vacuum tubes over in Russia under a new name, Sovtek. Sovtek was part of his bigger company, New Sensor. And this wasn't just like typical offshoring to save money. It was a total reinvention born out of pure necessity.
And that Sovtek era, especially the big muffs they made, they became instant cult classics in the 90s, right? The Green Russian, the Civil War muffs.
Oh, yeah. They were different. They were built in Russia, often using whatever parts were available, sometimes these heavy-duty military surplus enclosures. So they were built like tanks, they were cheap, and crucially, they sounded different. A bit darker, maybe heavier, more scooped in the mids than the 70s ones. And that sound, that thick, saturated, heavy sound, was just perfect for what was happening in the 90s with grunge, stoner rock, doom metal. The Sovtek muff basically carried the EHX torch while the original company was in exile.
That survival story is just incredible. So how did they manage to come back, relaunch in New York, thrive again in the 2000s? How did they compete against boutique builders and their own vintage legend status?
Well, their strategy when they relaunched in New York, early 2000s, it was smart. It was this careful balance. They knew they had to bring back the classics. So you got reissues of the Big Muff, the Memory Man, the Small Stone. Got to satisfy the people who want those original sounds.
But they didn't just become a reissue company. They started putting out genuinely new, modern stuff, too. Stuff that used new digital tech but still felt EHX, like the POG and the HOG. What was the big deal with the POG, the polyphonic octave generator?
Right, the key word there is polyphonic. See, older octave pedals, they could usually only handle one note at a time. If you played a chord, they'd freak out, glitch, sound awful.
Yeah.
The POG let you play a full chord like a G major, and it could accurately track and add octaves both above and below every note in that chord. Suddenly, your 6-string guitar could sound like a 12-string or even like a big Hammond organ.
Whoa, that's a massive leap. From analog bucket brigades to complex polyphonic pitch shifting.
Totally. And other innovations like the freeze pedal or the Super-Ego, these let you capture a note or a chord and just sustain it indefinitely, creating these amazing soundscapes. It just shows that Mike Matthews, even today, is still pushing boundaries, still independent, still run by the founder. EHX is now one of the most prolific pedal companies out there. Their catalog is huge, tiny micro pedals all the way up to complex multi-effects beasts.
Yeah, it really is the definition of a survivor brand. So we try and tie this all together. Why does Electro Harmonix really matter in the grand scheme of music history, beyond just making some cool pedals?
I think you can boil it down to maybe 4 key things. First, they just massively expanded the sounds available to everyday musicians. They took delay, flange, chorus, even synth sounds out of the super expensive studio world and put them into boxes people could actually afford and use live. Democratization, really. Second, the Big Muff Pi. It's not just another pedal, it's a fundamental sound. You could argue it's as iconic culturally as, say, a Stratocaster or a Les Paul is as an instrument. Its sonic footprint is that big. Third, their whole culture of just trying stuff. Fearless innovation, building a synth and a pedal, figuring out how to mimic tape flanging electronically. That whole attitude really set the stage, inspired countless boutique builders who came later. They showed what a stomp box could be. And finally, they're just a true survivor, independent all the way, navigated the 70s boom, the 80s crash, the 90s Russian detour, the digital revolution of the 2000s. And Mike Matthews is still at the helm. It's remarkable.
That persistence, that's maybe the final thought to leave you with. Think about Mike Matthews starting out an IBM salesman. He understood business, scale, distribution, and his relentless drive to make these experimental sounds cheap and accessible fundamentally changed everything. It forced this huge shift. Pro audio tech wasn't just for the rich studios anymore, it was for the kid in the garage. And if you really want to hear that shift in action, go find some recordings specifically using those Soviet-era green Russian big muffs. You'll instantly get why they were so huge, so essential to that heavy 90s alternative sound.